The streets of Philadelphia in 1989 were a labyrinth of concrete and cracked asphalt, where the sharp smells of fried food mixed with the stale stench of industrial decay. The city had fallen into hard times. Factories that once powered the American dream were now abandoned husks, their windows boarded up and their smokestacks silenced. The people of the neighborhoods, once filled with pride, had now grown hardened, living under the weight of a collapsing economy and rising crime. In this landscape, power was often defined by the reach of a man's influence, and for the Santos family, it was the grip they had on their corner of the city. Carlos Santos, the patriarch, was the kind of man whose presence alone could shift the tides of an entire block. He had lived through the worst the streets had to offer, rising from the ranks of a small-time hustler to the head of a feared family operation. Carlos wasn't a large man, but he carried himself with a quiet, commanding force. He wore the worn denim jacket of someone who had been through the hard knocks of life, his eyes always scanning the horizon, always looking for the next move. His sons, Marco and Luis, shared the same sharp eyes, though they were cut from different cloth. Marco, at 24, had inherited his father's calm, calculating nature. He wasn't prone to wild bursts of rage, but when he spoke, people listened. His mind was always working 2-3 steps ahead, a skill that made him invaluable to the family business. Luis, on the other hand, was 21, brash and headstrong, and constantly itching for action. He had a temper, and his quick fists often got him into trouble. But his loyalty to his family ran deeper than anyone could understand. The Santos family wasn't just about muscle. They controlled a complex web of operations, from extorting small businesses to dealing drugs in every corner of the city. They had their hands in everything, and everyone knew that crossing them meant consequences, but the family's power was also built on respect. People feared Carlos Santos not because of his gun, but because of his ability to read people and situations. He understood one thing above all: disrespect, once shown, demanded a response. That's why the theft of the family's rare .45 caliber revolver, a symbol of their power, wasn't just a simple crime. It was a challenge. The weapon wasn't just valuable. It was a legacy, passed down from Carlos's father, a symbol of his own rise in the streets. When word spread that members of the Callahan gang had stolen it, the Santos family's world was rocked. This wasn't a random act, it was a declaration. And Carlos knew what that meant. Sitting in the dim light of his kitchen, Carlos leaned back in his chair, staring at the old .45 framed on the wall. His sons were there, quiet, but waiting for his decision. Marco, calm as ever, lit a cigarette. Luis, fidgeting with his hands, couldn't sit still. Tension in the room was palpable. Carlos finally broke the silence, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "We're going to make them regret this." The moment Carlos spoke, the room fell into a heavy silence. Luis's fists clenched at his sides. He was ready. He had always been ready for action, never one to sit back when a fight called. His blood boiled with the thought of those Callahan punks walking around with the Santos family's gun, showing it off as if they had the power to take anything they wanted. "You want to hit them tonight?" Luis asked, his voice sharp with impatience. Carlos, however, remained calm. No, we wait. We gather information first. He turned to Marco, who was always the one to think things through. Marco, I want you to figure out where they're keeping the gun. We need to make sure we hit them where it hurts. Marco nodded, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. I'll get it done, but we can't go in half-assed. We need to make a statement. Carlos leaned forward, his gaze intense. That's the plan. We're not just taking back the gun. We're burning their whole operation to the ground. They'll know who runs these streets after tonight. Luis opened his mouth to probe protest, but Marco spoke first. We need to be smart about this. They'll be expecting some kind of retaliation. We don't want to just run in and get ourselves caught in a crossfire. The tension between the two brothers was palpable. Luis wanted to act now without thinking, while Marco was the one who always kept his head. But in this moment, Carlos knew that Marco's plan made the most sense. If they were to make an impact, it needed to be calculated. It needed to send a message that would echo across the streets of Philadelphia. Carlos rose from the table, his expression hardening. Get the crew ready. We strike tomorrow night. Marco, Luis, prepare yourselves. Marco and Luis exchanged looks, the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just about a stolen gun anymore. It was about honor, power, and legacy. The streets of Philadelphia would never be the same after this. Carlos stepped outside into the cool night air. The city was alive with the hum of street lights and distant car engines. But for the Santos family, the night was just beginning. The Callahans had made a fatal mistake, and now the Santos family was ready to show them what it meant to disrespect the wrong people. The following day felt like a slow crawl for the Santos family. Each passing hour intensified the weight of the plan they'd set in motion. The city of Philadelphia seemed unchanged, but for the Santos family, every corner, every alleyway felt like an impending battleground. The streets were full of life, but beneath the surface, tension rippled like an unspoken current. Marco and Luis spent most of the day scouting, as Carlos had ordered. They kept their distance from the Callahan crew, watching from shadowed corners, making mental notes of their movements, their hangouts, their rhythms. It was all about precision, knowing their every move before they made it. For Marco, this was second nature. The planning, the patience, the waiting, it was all part of the game. Luis, on the other hand, grew restless. His thoughts constantly circled back to the gun, the symbol of their power stolen so easily. He was itching for retribution, eager to hit the Callahans with a force so fierce that it would send a message loud enough to echo through the city. The sun dipped behind the skyline, and the mood in the Santos household shifted. There was a quiet intensity in the air. Carlos sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small stack of bills and reports in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had lived through a lot of wars, both personal and professional, but something about this felt different. The disrespect had cut deep, not just because of the gun, but because of the challenge it represented. This wasn't just about reclaiming lost property. It was about reclaiming their position, their legacy. Luis paced the room, his boots tapping impatiently against the floor. He stopped, throwing a look at his father. We don't wait any longer. I'm ready to move. This is taking too long. Carlos didn't respond immediately. He knew that Luis's impulsiveness was a dangerous trait, but it was one that he had learned to control when necessary. Patience, he finally said, his voice steady. We'll strike tonight when the time is right. You're not just reclaiming a gun, Luis. You're making a statement. It has to be perfect. Luis clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with anger. And if they're waiting for us? Carlos didn't flinch. Then they'll learn what happens when you mess with the wrong family. It was Marco who spoke next, his tone calm as ever. The Callahans are smart. They'll be expecting something. We need to hit them hard and fast, but not recklessly. If we show them too much too soon, they'll retaliate. Luis threw his hands up in frustration. I don't care about what they might do. We've been waiting long enough. Let's just finish this. Carlos stood slowly, his presence filling the room. Tonight, he said firmly, we strike when they least expect it. This isn't just about getting back a weapon. It's about showing the city who runs these streets. Do you understand? Both Marco and Luis nodded, their expressions now serious, focused. The family had made their choice. They would go to war, but they would go on their terms. No one could stand against them if they made their move wisely. The clock ticked closer to midnight. The plan had been set. Every movement, every action would be crucial. It was the beginning of a night that would change everything. The streets of Philadelphia were eerily quiet as midnight approached. The usual noise of cars and conversations was replaced by the sound of distant sirens and the wind rustling through the alleyways. The Santos family was ready. They'd been preparing for hours, each member keeping to their assigned roles. The crew was assembled, and Carlos gave one last silent nod to his sons before the operation began. Marco had the lead. His mind was sharp, as always, and he moved through the night like a ghost. Luis, as impatient as ever, kept close behind, his fingers twitching, ready for the violence he was sure would follow. The Santos family moved in perfect unison, a well-oiled machine prepared for war. Carlos, too, was on the move, but he stayed in the background, watching. He was the strategist, the one who set the pieces in motion and then let the rest of the family handle the execution. They were going to hit the Callahans where it hurt the most. Their territory, their pride, their very foundation. The Callahan crew had gathered in one of their familiar spots, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a place they frequented, hidden just enough to keep their operations under the radar, but close enough to the heart of the city to make a statement. They didn't expect trouble tonight. They didn't know the Santos family was coming. As Marco and Luis approached the warehouse, they moved like shadows, keeping low and silent. Their steps were deliberate, calculated, the air thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Marco checked his watch. It was time. They hit the front of the warehouse first. Marco gave a quick signal to Luis, and they stormed in, guns drawn. The Callahans, caught completely off guard, scrambled to react. A few shots rang out as the Santos family took control of the space. It was swift, it was brutal, and it was over before the Callahans had time to regroup. Luis's heart raced with adrenaline. He moved through the warehouse with reckless abandon, dishing out violence with each step. But Marco was more controlled. He made sure to leave a mark on each of the Callahan members. Punishment, a warning, not just a simple robbery. Carlos entered just as the last of the Callahans were being rounded up. He stood at the entrance of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the chaos. His sons had done their part, and now the family had made its statement. Marco turned to Carlos, a small, grim smile on his face. It's done. Carlos walked toward the nearest Callahan, who was trembling on the floor, barely able to speak. He knelt down, looked him in the eye, and said in a cold, quiet voice, "This is just the beginning. You took something that doesn't belong to you. Now, you'll pay the price." Carlos didn't wait for a response. He stood and gave the signal to leave. The Santos family had made its point. The Callahans had learned what it meant to cross them. And as the Santos family disappeared into the night, the message was clear. The streets of Philadelphia were still theirs to command. The night had fallen heavy with the weight of what the Santos family had done. The streets were still alive with the distant hum of city traffic, but for Carlos Santos and his family, the job wasn't over. They had sent a message, yes, but it wasn't enough. The Callahans were a prideful bunch, and Carlos knew that pride could either lead to silence or retribution. He wasn't willing to wait for either. Marco sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his gun, the soft clink of metal against metal filling the otherwise silent room. His mind, sharp and calculating as always, was already working through the next phase of the plan. Luis, on the other hand, stood by the window, restless, his fingers tapping against the worn frame. He was eager. Too eager, perhaps. "They're going to retaliate," Luis said quietly, his voice carrying the anticipation that had been building in him since the moment they'd left the warehouse. Carlos, seated across from Marco, glanced up, his expression unreadable. "They'll try, but they don't have the strength we do. Not anymore. The Callahans are a fractured family, too much pride and not enough discipline." Luis's jaw clenched, and he turned away from the window. "So, what do we do now? We just wait for them to strike first?" Carlos shook his head slowly, his gaze drifting to the framed photograph of his father hanging on the wall. "No. We set them up. We go after their people they care about. We take their foundation apart piece by piece until they have nothing left to fight with." Marco looked up from cleaning his gun, a sharp gleam in his eye. "We hurt them where it matters. Family, friends, business. Make them bleed. Make them hurt in ways they can't ignore. They won't be able to keep hiding behind their pride when it's their people who are suffering." Carlos's voice was low but deadly. "We're not just making an example anymore, Marco. We're destroying them. Once and for all." Luis, who had been pacing with his hands clenched into fists, stopped suddenly. "We'll go in and take it all. Make them pay for what they did, and I want to be the one to do it. Take the lead." Carlos looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll do your part, Luis. But don't get too reckless. We make them pay, but we do it smart." The tension in the room was palpable. Luis was hungry for action, and Marco was ready to move with calculated precision. But it was Carlos, the calm heart of the family, who was keeping them in check. "We make them fear us," Carlos continued, his voice cool and steady. "We don't just burn their businesses. We take everything from them. People, possessions, and their very will to keep fighting. When we're done, there will be nothing left for them to return to." Luis's eyes were burning with anticipation. "Then, let's move tonight. Show them we're not messing around." Carlos stood slowly, his presence commanding the room. He knew his sons, knew their temperaments and their strengths. He had spent years building the Santos family. But now, with the Callahans stepping over the line, it was time to finish what had been started. "Tonight, we burn them down," he said, with a finality that hung in the air. the words sealing their fate. We take everything. As the Santos family set their plans into motion, the Callahans were far from defeated. They had been humiliated, but they weren't going to stay down. Their pride wouldn't allow it. Word spread quickly through their ranks that the Santos family had made a bold move. The violence had escalated, and now it was personal. The Callahans had always been known for their brutality, but this felt different. This wasn't a simple turf war. It was a vendetta. Raymond Callahan, the leader of the Callahan family, paced nervously in his office. He was a large man with a commanding presence that had earned him respect, but tonight there was an unease in his movements that couldn't be ignored. He had seen the Santos family take risks before, but this time it felt like they were fighting for more than just power. They were fighting for something that couldn't be replaced. Honor. Carlos Santos thinks he can make an example of us, Raymond muttered to himself, his fingers running over the scar on his left cheek, a mark of his own past battles. He's going to regret that. His brother, Jake Callahan, stood by the door, arms folded. He had a reputation for being just as ruthless as Raymond, but his methods were less strategic and more brute force. Jake was itching for revenge, but he was more impulsive than his older brother, which often led to rash decisions. We can hit them tonight, Ray. Hard. Show them what happens when you mess with us. Raymond paused, his eyes narrowing. No, we don't go in blind. The Santos family is more organized than we thought. They want war? They'll get it, but we'll fight on our terms. Jake scowled. What are you thinking? Raymond sat down at his desk, his mind working through the next steps. We'll move first, but we won't just retaliate. We'll strike where it hurts the most. I want them to feel the pain we felt when they took our territory. We go after their operations, destroy them from the inside. He looked over at his younger brother. You want to hit them tonight? Fine, but it has to be calculated, no more mistakes. We burn them down piece by piece until they understand what it means to mess with the Callahans. Jake's eyes lit up, a grin forming on his face. That's more like it. Let's burn them down then. Raymond leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating the moves. He knew the Santos family well. He had grown up with Carlos Santos, and the rivalry between them went back years. This wasn't just about a stolen gun. This was about power. And Raymond wouldn't allow Carlos to take control of the streets without a fight. We hit their people first, Raymond said. No one is safe. We take down their supply lines, their businesses, and we hit them where it hurts. Family. Jake's grin widened. I'm ready. Raymond stood up slowly, his hand resting on the table. Get the crew ready. We move at dawn. But remember, we hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we don't leave any witnesses. The Callahans were no strangers to violence, but this time, it would be different. It would be a fight to the bitter end. And Raymond would make sure that when the dust settled, it would be the Santos family lying in the rubble, not them. The tension between the Santos and Callahan families reached a boiling point in the days following the raid. Both families had sent their messages, but neither was willing to back down. The streets of Philadelphia became a battlefield, with every corner of the city feeling the heat of the war. The violence wasn't just confined to the back alleys anymore. It was spilling into the open, as if everyone on the block knew something big was coming. The peace that had once reigned over the neighborhoods was now shattered, replaced by an undercurrent of fear and retribution. Carlos Santos had always been a methodical man. He had spent years building his empire with patience and precision, but the Callahans' brazen theft and violent retaliation forced his hand. The first strike was a success. Revenge for the stolen gun, yes, but also a message to the Callahans. It was a statement of power, one that Carlos had intended to be as loud as it was clear. But the Callahans had their own message to send, and they weren't going to let the Santos family destroy everything they had built. Raymond Callahan, the leader of the Callahan gang, had grown tired of playing defense. His pride, once a driving force, was now his greatest weakness. He knew his family had been caught off guard during the initial attack, but now they were ready. They would fight back with everything they had, no matter the cost. It was Marco Santos who first noticed the shift in the air. The tension was palpable even before the first shots were fired. There was something different about the Callahan response. It wasn't just about the gun anymore. It was personal. It was a matter of honor. "They're coming for us, Marco," Luis said one evening, his voice grim as he stared out the window of their family's safe house. "They've made it clear." Carlos, who had been quietly watching his sons, stood up from his chair. "It's time we finish this. No more waiting. No more games. We go straight for their heart." Marco nodded, the calculation in his eyes already forming the next steps. "We hit them where they're weakest. No more subtlety. We take everything they have. Their territory, their family, their reputation." Luis clenched his fists. "I'm ready for that. We end it tonight." The Santos family moved quickly, their strategy clear. They had been laying the groundwork for this final push ever since the Callahans had stolen their prized gun. Marco had already gathered intel on the Callahans' remaining supply lines and safe houses. The next strike would be fast and brutal. They would cut off the Callahans' ability to operate. At the same time, Raymond Callahan was planning his retaliation. He knew the Santos family wouldn't stop until they had claimed complete dominance of the streets. Raymond wasn't a fool. He knew this war wouldn't be over until one family stood and the other was broken. The streets became a place of constant danger. No one knew who would strike next or when. Gunfire rang out in the distance every night. People who had once felt safe now walked with eyes over their shoulders, wary of the next attack. That night, Marco's plan went into motion. The Santos family attacked first, targeting a warehouse used by the Callahans to store their guns and illegal goods. It was a bold strike, one that would send a loud message to their enemies. They struck swiftly, surrounding the area, cutting off escape routes before the Callahans had time to respond. The Callahans were not as unprepared as the Santos had hoped. Raymond Callahan had gotten word of the impending attack, and his crew was waiting. As the Santos family breached the warehouse, shots rang out, and the two sides collided in a furious, bloody battle. Carlos and Marco fought side by side, their guns blazing. Luis, hungry for vengeance, tore through the warehouse with reckless abandon, his adrenaline-fueled rage turning him into a force of nature. The fight was brutal, but the Santos family had the advantage in numbers and preparation. In the end, the warehouse was engulfed in flames. The Callahans had been pushed out, their supplies destroyed. The Santos family had won the battle, but at what cost? As the fire consumed the warehouse, Carlos stood amidst the wreckage, surveying the damage. It wasn't enough. He could feel it in his bones. The Callahans would not go down easily. They would rise from the ashes, and the war was far from over. The next few days were marked by a chilling silence. The Callahans, humiliated and wounded, retreated into the shadows. Raymond Callahan, once the proud leader of a powerful gang, now seemed like a cornered animal. His pride, already shattered, was now his greatest weakness. He knew that if he didn't act soon, the Santos family would obliterate everything he had worked for. Carlos Santos, however, wasn't taking any chances. He knew that the Callahans were planning something. There was no way they would let the Santos family strike first and get away with it. Carlos had spent his entire life understanding the rhythm of the streets, and he knew that the Callahans would lash out, desperate to reclaim their power. But Carlos also knew that this fight would be different. This would be the end of the war. One family would be left standing, and the other would be crushed under the weight of their own pride. He had built his empire with calculated moves, and now he had to finish what had been started. "We move tonight," Carlos said, his voice steady as he looked at his sons. "This ends now." Marco and Luis nodded. They had been through hell in the past week, but the end was now in sight. The Santos family had taken everything from the Callahans. Now it was time to finish what they had started. The plan was simple. The Santos family would take the fight straight to the heart of the Callahans' operations. The Callahan compound, located in the heart of the city, would be their target. This would be their final assault. It was the last chance the Callahans had to prove they could survive. Carlos and his sons moved swiftly through the city streets, their crew of loyal followers trailing behind. The air was thick with anticipation. There was no turning back now. The Callahans had made a fatal mistake by attacking the Santos family, and now they would pay the price. As the Santos family reached the edge of the Callahan compound, they saw the familiar signs of tension. Guards stationed outside, eyes darting nervously, unsure of what was about to happen. The Callahans had learned the hard way that Carlos Santos didn't fight fair. They had underestimated him, and now they would pay. Marco led the charge, his movements quick and precise. The Santos family stormed the compound, guns raised, ready for whatever came next. The Callahans fought back fiercely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The battle was fierce, but the Santos family had already secured their victory. The Callahans were broken. Raymond Callahan, bloodied and desperate, was cornered in his office. The Santos family had won the war. Carlos entered the office slowly, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Raymond Callahan looked up, his eyes filled with defiance. "You think this is over?" Raymond spat, blood dripping from his mouth. Carlos smiled, a slow, cold smile. "Yes, Raymond, it's over." With that, the Santos family secured their place as the undisputed rulers of Philadelphia's streets. The war had ended, and the city would never forget the price of disrespect. The streets of Philadelphia were quieter now, but the tension still lingered in the air. The Santos family had emerged victorious, their dominance over the Callahan gang complete. But even in victory, Carlos Santos knew that the real challenge was just beginning. With the Callahans decimated, there was a power vacuum in the city's underground world, a space waiting to be filled by whoever was bold enough to take it. And Carlos knew that every corner of Philadelphia would be watching. For Carlos, victory wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about solidifying the Santos family's place at the top. The power they had fought so hard for could slip away just as easily if they didn't move quickly. The city's other gangs were already making moves, testing the waters to see if the Santos family would flinch. As the Santos family settled into their new position of power, the city was rife with whispers. Some gangs were already negotiating deals, looking to align themselves with the Santos family to avoid conflict. Others, however, were considering a more aggressive approach, seeing the void left by the Callahans as an opportunity to seize control for themselves. The streets once owned by the Callahans now belonged to anyone with the courage and the firepower to take it. Carlos sat in his study, a room filled with the smell of cigar smoke and the distant hum of the city outside. He was alone, his mind working furiously. It had been a week since the Callahans had been wiped out, but the peace they had won felt fragile. He could feel the weight of the city's expectations pressing down on him, and he knew that the Santos family's reputation had to remain untouchable. Marco entered the room, a quiet presence as always. "There's word on the streets," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Other families are testing us. They think we're weak, that we're vulnerable now." Carlos didn't look up from his desk. "Let them test us," he said, his voice steady. "But if they cross the line, we make sure they regret it. We can't show weakness. We can't allow anyone to think they can take what we've earned." Luis, who had been pacing outside the door, stepped into the room, his face filled with impatience. "What do we do then? If everyone's making their move, why sit here waiting?" Carlos finally looked up at his sons, his gaze hard and calculating. "Because, Luis, we're not reacting. We're making the next move. We take the fight to them first." Luis smirked. "I like the sound of that. Let's make them regret ever thinking they could take over." Carlos nodded. "We go after their strongholds. We hit them where it hurts most. We send a message to the entire city. The Santos family rules these streets." The following nights were filled with strategic moves. Marco and Luis worked together, scouting the other families and analyzing their weaknesses. They hit warehouses, disrupted trade routes, and systematically dismantled anyone who dared challenge their power. The Santos family made it clear anyone looking to take the Callahans' place would have to deal with the wrath of the Santos family first. But as they consolidated their power, Carlos knew that the hardest part was yet to come. They had defeated the Callahans, but the real battle was for control of the city's future. No one, not even the Santos family, could hold the throne forever. The key would be maintaining their power and ensuring that no one else could rise to challenge them. In the brutal world of Philadelphia's underbelly, it was a constant fight for survival. Weeks had passed since the Santos family took control of the city's streets, but the aftermath of the Callahan massacre was still fresh in the minds of everyone in Philadelphia. The city, with its gritty streets and fractured communities, had become a battlefield. But now, with the Callahans wiped off the map, it seemed that the Santos family was unstoppable. Or at least, that's how it appeared. Carlos sat at the head of the table in the Santos family headquarters, the quiet hum of the city outside muffled by the thick brick walls. Marco and Luis flanked him, both of them serious, the weight of their recent actions etched into their faces. They had won the war, but as with all victories in their world, it felt hollow. They had wiped out the Callahans, but in the process, they had made enemies out of everyone else who had once respected them. Carlos had always known that the price of power was high. He had worked for years, building his family's empire from the ground up, but now he felt the strain more than ever. The game had changed, the rules had changed, and no matter how hard the Santos family worked to keep their grip on the streets, Carlos knew that they were just one mistake away from losing it all. "Dad," Marco began, his voice cutting through the silence of the room, "we've been too focused on maintaining control. People are starting to question our position. We need to show them that we're in charge, that we're untouchable." Carlos leaned back in his chair, taking a long drag from his cigar. His gaze was unwavering as he considered Marco's words. Marco had been right about one thing. They needed to reassert their dominance, but Carlos wasn't ready to move just yet. "We don't need to prove anything to anyone," Carlos replied slowly. "They know who we are. What we need is to secure our future, and that means making sure there's no one left who can challenge us." Luis, always the hothead, stood up, unable to keep his frustration in check. "We've taken everything from the Callahans. We should move on to the next target. Take down the rest of these families that think they can step into the void." Carlos raised a hand, silencing his younger son. "Patience, Luis. We don't burn everything at once. We pick our battles. You know this." Marco nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I agree with Dad. We need to plan for the long game. If we wipe out every family now, we won't have anyone left to take over. We need to build alliances." The debate between them was heavy, filled with years of history and bloodshed. The Santos family had built their empire through force and fear, but Carlos had always known there was more to power than just violence. There were deals to be made, alliances to be forged, and that was the next step, securing their legacy. But the price of securing their future was steep. As the family made their plans, the streets of Philadelphia continued to buzz with the tension of uncertainty. One wrong move, and the war would start all over again. Carlos stood and looked out the window at the dark streets below. He could feel the weight of history bearing down on him. His family had built their empire through blood, but it would be their ability to control the future that would determine whether the Santos family would remain untouchable or crumble like so many before them. The legacy of blood was etched into the streets, and the Santos family would have to keep fighting to hold on to it. It was an unspoken truth in the world the Santos family navigated. The hardest battles weren't always fought with weapons, but with trust. And the worst enemies weren't always visible. As the Santos family solidified its control over Philadelphia's underground world, cracks began to appear within their own ranks. Carlos had always prided himself on the loyalty of his family, but even the tightest-knit crews could unravel under pressure. The Callahan War had been brutal, but it had earned the Santos family the respect of other gangs in the city. However, respect was fleeting, and power, even when seized by force, could be easily lost. Carlos's sharp instincts told him that someone within their circle was playing both sides, feeding information to the enemies who were waiting for a chance to strike. Carlos had noticed the changes in a few of his trusted men. Rumors of a traitor had begun to circulate, small whispers, half-heard conversations. Marco, as always, had his ear to the ground, and even he couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to them was making moves behind their backs. It was late one evening when Marco first brought it up. He had come back from a late-night meeting with a contact, his face more tense than usual. "Dad, I think we've got a rat," Marco said, his voice low but firm as he sat across from Carlos in their private room. The dim light of the desk lamp cast shadows over Marco's face, his expression one of hard determination. Carlos raised an eyebrow, looking up from his papers. "A rat?" he repeated. "Explain." Marco's eyes were piercing, his mind clearly working through the details. "I don't know who yet, but I've been hearing things from people we trust. They say we've got someone feeding the Callahans information, maybe more than one. Word is getting out about our operations." Carlos's gaze darkened. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "We can't afford any weakness now." Luis, who had been listening from the corner, jumped in, his impatience showing. "We don't need to waste time guessing. Let's find them and make them pay." Carlos raised a hand, his usual calm demeanor masking the fury that boiled inside. He knew Luis wanted to strike hard, but this was a delicate situation. If they made the wrong move, it could unravel everything they'd worked for. He needed to be strategic. Finding the traitor required patience. "We'll handle this carefully," Carlos said, looking at both of his sons. "We need to find the leak before we move on anyone. If we make a wrong choice, it could tear the family apart." For the next several days, Marco and Luis worked together to find the traitor. They followed every lead, every whisper. Marco, always methodical, gathered intelligence from their trusted sources. Luis, with his natural instincts for violence, was ready to take action on anyone he deemed guilty. But the truth, when it finally came, was worse than either of them expected. The traitor wasn't just anyone, it was one of their own. Carlos's most trusted lieutenant, Sergio, had been giving information to the remnants of the Callahan gang. It wasn't just about power struggles. It was about money. Promises of a new future with the Callahans in control of the city. Sergio had sold them out for a price, betraying the Santos family in the worst possible way. When the confrontation came, it was swift and brutal. Sergio didn't even try to deny it when confronted. His eyes were filled with shame and fear, but he knew the consequences. Carlos didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to show weakness. With Sergio's death came a grim realization for Carlos. The Santos family had grown too large, too powerful. They were now vulnerable from within, and the danger wasn't just on the streets. The real threat could come from the ones who claimed to be loyal. The death of Sergio weighed heavily on the Santos family, especially on Carlos. He had always known that power came with a cost. But in that moment, the price of keeping the family together seemed higher than ever. Trust, the very thing that had held their empire together, had been shattered by one of their own. Carlos couldn't help but wonder if it was inevitable, if loyalty could ever truly last in the kind of world they lived in. The streets of Philadelphia still buzzed with rumors. The Callahans were broken, but other gangs were beginning to test the waters, sensing the vulnerability in the Santos family. And even though the Callahans were no longer a threat, there were always new enemies waiting to rise. Marco sat next to Carlos, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Luis had taken to the streets, always ready for action. But Marco knew that their father was reflecting on the long-term implications of Sergio's betrayal. The problem wasn't just with the traitor. It was with the system Carlos had built. "Dad," Marco said, breaking the silence, "we need to focus on the future. The other families are circling. They know we're vulnerable. It's time to make sure we don't let this happen again." Carlos exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his desk. "I know, Marco. But the question is, how? We can't just kill everyone who might be a threat. We need something bigger." Luis burst through the door, his usual confidence gone. "I've been hearing things. Other families want to take our place. They're making moves. There's a storm coming, and it's only a matter of time before we're forced to fight again." Carlos nodded slowly, considering the situation. His sons were right. The betrayal was only the beginning of their troubles. The world they had created wasn't sustainable in its current form. The pressure of maintaining control was starting to break the very foundation they had built their empire on. "We need to strengthen our position," Carlos said finally. "We need alliances, real strategic ones. We can't afford to lose any more ground. If we want to stay at the top, we need to adapt. And we need to show them we can still bring the pain." Marco leaned forward. "I'm already working on it. There are other families, smaller crews who are willing to join us. We can solidify our place with them." Luis grinned, "And I'm ready to remind everyone who the real power is. A little blood and fire go a long way in this city." Carlos studied his sons. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but the war they had been fighting had changed. This was no longer just about fighting off rivals. It was about building something that could last, something that would keep the Santos name at the top for good. The price of power had always been high, but now Carlos knew that the price of keeping it would be even higher. It wasn't just about control anymore. It was about survival. As the days passed, Carlos Santos worked tirelessly to solidify his family's hold on Philadelphia's underworld. The alliance talks Marco had initiated with smaller crews had been successful. Several of the city's more influential gangs, wary of the power vacuum left by the Callahans, had agreed to align themselves with the Santos family. These alliances, forged through promises and threats alike, were intended to protect the family from any further internal fractures and external threats. However, in the deepest corners of his mind, Carlos knew the truth. Power was fragile. One wrong move, one slip-up, and it could all come crashing down. The city was alive with rumors, and though many gangs had chosen to side with the Santos family, there were always new challengers rising, waiting for an opportunity to dethrone them. Marco and Luis were ever vigilant, working together to ensure that their family's empire remained secure. Marco, with his sharp mind and meticulous planning, managed the growing web of alliances. He was a patient strategist, keenly aware that their family's strength now lay in the loyalty of those they had made deals with. Luis, always brash and full of action, kept the streets in check, sending a clear message to anyone thinking of challenging the Santos family's position. His presence in the city was felt everywhere, his reputation growing every day. But even in the midst of this calculated expansion, there was a sense of unease that lingered. Every corner, every street, every ally was an opportunity for betrayal. Carlos had seen it before. When men were given power, they were just as likely to turn on you as they were to support you. It was the nature of the game. And Carlos had learned long ago that trust was a commodity that came at a steep price. One evening, Carlos stood in the back office of the Santos family compound, staring out at the dimming lights of the city. The tension had eased a little since Sergio's betrayal, but it wasn't gone. He knew that the peace they had now was only temporary. For how long could alliances hold? How long before someone in their ranks decided they wanted more? "Dad," Marco said, breaking Carlos's thoughts. He had entered the room quietly, his usual calm demeanor giving nothing away. "We've got another problem." Carlos turned slowly, his brow furrowing. "What's going on?" Marco stepped forward, holding up a folder with a few documents inside. "A few of the smaller crews we've aligned with have been approached by someone new. They're trying to recruit them, offering better deals, fewer strings attached. It's clear they're trying to test our authority." Carlos's eyes darkened. "Who?" "We don't know yet, but I've been hearing rumors. There's a new player in town, someone moving in the shadows. We need to find out who it is before this turns into something worse." Carlos sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. The game had changed. They had fought for control, bled for it, and now, with the Callahans gone, someone else wanted to take it. The calm they'd fought for was about to be shattered. "We find them," Carlos said, his voice low and resolute. "And we make sure they understand that this city is ours. I want them gone before they have a chance to start anything." Marco nodded, turning to leave. "I'll take care of it. We'll figure out who's behind this." As Marco left the room, Carlos stared out the window again. The shadows of the city growing longer. The storm was coming. The question was no longer whether they could survive it, but whether they could control it before it consumed them. By the time Carlos had finished his late-night cigar, Marco had gathered enough information to begin putting together a clearer picture of the emerging threat. It wasn't one of the city's established gangs. It was someone new, someone who wasn't playing by the rules of the underworld that had governed Philadelphia for decades. Marco sat in the family office, documents spread across the desk in front of him. He had traced the connections back to a series of smaller, seemingly unconnected incidents. A few missing shipments of drugs, a few disrupted deals. It wasn't until one of the younger associates had mentioned a name that everything clicked into place. Victor Leone. Marco muttered to himself as he read the name on the sheet. It wasn't a name he had heard in the city before, and that alone made it dangerous. The absence of history meant that there was no clear way to predict what kind of power he could amass. But Marco was certain of one thing. Leone was positioning himself to challenge the Santos family's control. Carlos entered the room just as Marco was piecing everything together. His face was hard, his thoughts focused. "What did you find?" Marco looked up, a steely determination in his eyes. "Victor Leone. A ghost until now. He's been pulling strings from the shadows, slowly working his way into the city's underground. He's been offering deals to some of the smaller crews we've been working with. He's not just trying to take over. They're trying to take us down from the inside." Carlos's eyes narrowed. "How many?" Marco hesitated for a moment, then replied, "A few, but I think it's just the beginning. We need to hit them before they get organized. If we don't act fast, they'll have enough leverage to challenge us head on." Carlos took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. They had worked too hard to let someone like Leone take what was theirs. He couldn't let a new player destabilize everything they had built. The city was theirs, and anyone who thought otherwise needed to be eliminated. "We go after Leone, and we go hard," Carlos said, his voice cold and resolute. No mercy. I want him out of the picture, and I want his men gone. We take the fight to him before he has a chance to mobilize. Marco nodded, already planning their next steps. We'll find him, Dad. We'll hit him where it hurts. The Santos family was about to face a new kind of war. Victor Leone wasn't like the Callahans. He was more cunning, more dangerous in ways they hadn't expected. But Carlos Santos wasn't about to let anyone take what he had built. The battle for control of Philadelphia's streets was far from over. And this time, it would be bloodier than ever. Carlos stood, looking at his sons, determination burning in his eyes. Let's make sure that Victor Leone understands that no one takes from the Santos family and gets away with it. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when the Santos family made their move. Carlos had been preparing for this moment, knowing it would come. Victor Leone's rise was a threat to everything the Santos family had worked for. His quiet challenge from the shadows had to be dealt with swiftly. Marco, ever calm and methodical, had already mapped out the plan. They would hit Leone's operations hard and fast, starting with the warehouse on the outskirts of the city where his crew was stashing guns, drugs, and cash. It was a symbolic strike, taking down the heart of Leone's operations before he could gain real traction. Luis, always eager for action, had no patience. He was ready to spill blood, to take control by force. But Carlos remained calm. We move fast, but we make sure they can't rebuild, Carlos said, his voice steady. The Santos family surrounded the warehouse, slipping into position under the cover of darkness. Marco gave the signal, and the assault began. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, the shock wave of violence shaking the ground beneath them. The Callahan remnants were caught off guard, unable to fight back effectively. In the chaos, Marco and Luis fought like a well-oiled machine. Marco's precision picked off enemies in the shadows, while Luis's impulsive violence overwhelmed anyone in his path. Within an hour, the warehouse was in flames, and Leone's men lay scattered on the floor. Marco stood over the wreckage, his expression cold. We've sent our message. Carlos's eyes were hard, his mind already on the next move. It's not over yet. Leone will come for us, but now he knows we're not afraid to fight dirty. The weeks after the warehouse strike felt like a tense calm before the storm. Carlos knew that while the first hit had shattered Leone's operations, it hadn't been enough to crush his ambition. Leone wasn't the type to back down. He would rise from the ashes, and the Santos family needed to be ready. Marco and Luis continued their work, disrupting what little remained of Leone's operation. Marco methodically dismantled their networks, while Luis moved faster, attacking with his usual intensity. But Carlos felt the weight of the city pressing down on them. Leone's people were still out there, waiting to strike back. We need to hit his inner circle, Marco suggested one evening, after gathering intelligence on Leone's remaining allies. If we don't take them down, this will drag on. Carlos didn't hesitate. We hit them tonight, we destroy everything. Luis, always hungry for action, was already ready to move. Let's end this once and for all. They attacked Leone's key safe houses under the cover of night, using their alliances to draw out his remaining men. The Santos family moved like shadows, taking out Leone's lieutenants one by one. The fight was swift, violent, and calculated. When the dust settled, Leone's operations were shattered. Marco stood over the wreckage, his face hard. It's done, Dad. They won't rise again. Carlos nodded, his eyes cold with resolve. We've taken the city. No one will challenge us again. The Santos family had solidified their grip on Philadelphia's underworld. The reckoning had come, and the city would never forget who was truly in control. The dust from the final battle had settled, and the city of Philadelphia, once again, was under the control of the Santos family. The Callahans were gone, their operations wiped out in one brutal strike. Victor Leone's remnants had scattered like cockroaches in the light, and the smaller crews that once dreamed of challenging the Santos family now understood the cost of such ambition. Carlos Santos stood at the head of the table in the family's headquarters, surveying his sons and closest allies. The war was over, but the weight of their victory was heavy. Marco and Luis, though triumphant, understood that this peace would not last forever. Their father's empire was built on power, and power was always fleeting. We've done it, Marco said, his voice steady. But the city's never quiet for long. We need to make sure no one else tries to move in. Carlos nodded slowly. We've sent a message. No one takes from the Santos family without paying the price. But now we ensure the city stays under our rule. We secure our legacy. Luis, always brash, leaned forward. And we don't wait. We take out anyone who even thinks about challenging us. Carlos met his eyes with a steady gaze. Patience, Luis. The fight may be over, but the work is never done. Their eyes met. Their father's calm and calculated presence, the foundation that held them all together. The Santos family had secured their power, but Carlos knew the truth. This wasn't just about the streets. It was about building something that could last. The city was theirs, and they would protect it with everything they had. Even with their victory firmly in place, the Santos family couldn't escape the ghosts of their past. The bloodshed, the betrayals, the wars, they all had a price. Carlos had spent his life building an empire, but now, as he looked around at the city they had claimed, the cost seemed more evident than ever. Marco and Luis had worked tirelessly, but as their father's empire expanded, their bond began to fray. Marco had always been the strategist, the planner, while Luis thrived in the chaos of battle. But the endless pursuit of power had begun to take its toll. The family was stronger than ever, but something inside them had been irreparably changed. Carlos sat in his office late one night, staring out over the city he had conquered. The lights of Philadelphia stretched out before him, a sea of possibilities and threats. He had secured their future, but what had he sacrificed to get here? Luis entered the room, his face hard but tired. We've done what we needed to do, Dad. But there's still this emptiness, like we've lost something along the way. Carlos didn't reply immediately, his thoughts swirling. The fight had consumed them, and now they stood on the edge of something new. But at what cost? He had built a legacy, yes, but it had come with blood, betrayal, and the loss of parts of himself he couldn't reclaim. We've built something that will last, Carlos said quietly. But remember, Luis, power doesn't make you invincible. It just makes the fall harder. As the city settled into its restless routine below, The Santos family realized that victory was just another battle won in a never-ending war for survival. And in that war, there would always be a price to pay.